Picture this, it's midnight in a medieval village. The fire has long since died down. 10 people are sleeping in one single room, children, grandparents, servants, and even a goat tied near the hearth. Somewhere in the darkness, a husband slowly, silently reaches for his wife. There are no walls, no bedsheets, no privacy, just a pile of straw and the heavy awareness of everyone else listening. So how did love survive in a world where there was absolutely nowhere to be alone? And when the body still yearned, when desire whispered louder than any shame, where on earth did intimacy go to hide? There were no bedrooms as we know them. In most medieval homes, even the word room was a luxury. What we'd call a single room today was often the entire house, a packed, rectangular wooden space, or in northern lands, a dark longhouse made of stone, turf, or woven branches with a central fire pit and a hole in the roof for smoke. Inside lived everyone: parents, children, grandparents, maybe a cousin, maybe a servant, maybe even a cow. The bed. Often a shared mattress of straw laid on wooden slats, or sometimes just the floor covered with coarse wool. No pillows, no dividers, and certainly no doors to shut. According to records from the 13th century, most English peasants lived in homes with just one heated space. These were called open halls. Old household lists describe one bed for all as completely normal, not unusual at all. Day and night blurred together. A table used by day became a bed by night. Children were wrapped in the same blankets that covered their parents. And in winter, the family huddled close, not just for comfort, but for sheer survival. There was no privacy, there was barely even room to stretch out. And yet, this was the stage on which marriage was lived, where love tried to breathe in stale air, and couples tried to find each other in the dark. Marriage did not come with solitude, it came with company. Even after wedding vows were spoken and meals shared, the first night of marriage rarely meant privacy. In fact, it was often the complete opposite. Some communities even watched. Traditional wedding customs sometimes required witnesses to see the couple to bed, just to confirm the marriage was complete. But for most, intimacy had no grand ceremony, just endless obstacles. In court records from 14th century Yorkshire, a wife was accused of lying with her husband behind the bread oven because her family home had no other private space. In another case from Essex, a servant claimed she overheard her master and mistress every single night, separated only by a hanging piece of cloth. Sexual relations, which were expected within marriage, had to be carefully timed, well hidden, or endured silently. Parents waited until children were asleep or until the room fell completely quiet. Some waited for market days when the house would briefly empty. Others didn't wait at all. As church teaching demanded that the marriage debt be paid regularly, many couples did what they could, with blankets pulled high, voices kept low, and a silent understanding that everyone else heard everything. In one sense, love was never alone. In another, it was never truly free. When you can't build a wall, you hang a curtain. In homes where timber was scarce and stone was cold, fabric became the only barrier between bodies and watchful eyes. These weren't delicate, pretty veils. They were thick woolen cloths, sometimes patched together, sometimes lined with fur, strung across beams or nailed into rafters. They didn't block sound, but they created the vital illusion of space. For couples, even a thin partition meant something, a place to undress, to speak softly, to reach out without a dozen eyes staring. By the 15th century, wealthier peasants even listed bed curtains in their household inventories right alongside their cooking pots and tools, proof that privacy was highly valued, even if it was very rare. In towns, apprentices often shared sleeping quarters, but the master and his wife usually claimed the only curtained bed. The forester bed, with heavy drapes on all sides, became more than just a piece of furniture. It was like a room within a room, a cave of warmth, a precious space where touch and breath could belong to just 2 people, not 10. Still, most families made do with much less. A curtain over a corner, a blanket pinned to a beam, a simple screen of bundled reeds. It wasn't about completely blocking out others, it was about holding onto something of their own. In a world where space was always shared, privacy was an act of pure invention. Intimacy in the medieval home was not spontaneous. It was carefully planned and strategized. Couples learned to read the rhythm of the room, when the baby was finally asleep, when the neighbor had gone to market, when the fire was low and footsteps outside had completely faded away. Silence became a tool, a language, a promise. Words were risky, but a glance, a shared look at dusk, that was often enough. And they left small, secret signs: a turned-up shoe, a lantern placed in a certain spot to signal readiness or caution. In households with servants, one might feign illness to send them away. Others waited for daily tasks to scatter the family, fetching water, tending animals, collecting kindling. In regions without proper buildings, like barns, bakehouses, or storage huts, short escapes were possible. These became secret havens, a corner behind sacks of barley, a shadowed wall near the chicken coop. They weren't romantic hideaways, they were stolen moments, carved from noise and constant motion. And then there was timing. In winter, darkness fell early, the house quieted sooner, people slept longer, and in that slow descent into cold and stillness, couples found their narrow window. No doors, no locks, but still, somehow, a flicker of privacy survived just long enough. In matters of intimacy, social class changed everything. For the poor, the one-room house was the only world they knew. There were no spare chambers, no separate beds, no choice. Privacy was simply a fantasy, but for the wealthier, minor lords, merchants, prosperous farmers, privacy became a clear marker of status. By the late medieval period, some homes included a solar, an upper room specifically reserved for sleeping, away from the main hall. There, the lord and lady could retreat, behind a door with a lock and even a chimney for warmth. And perhaps for the first time, a space where love could truly unfold without witnesses. Inventories from 14th century Kent show separate bedchambers with curtains, linen sheets, and even small chests for personal items. In sharp contrast, the humble cottager and the serf still slept by the hearth beside the cradle, under a simple thatched roof. In monasteries and nunneries, intimacy was strictly forbidden, yet hidden corners and confessionals still tell their silent stories. Even in castles, where nobles had rooms, walls were thin, dependents listened, gossip traveled, and so privacy was never absolute. It was always scaled, shaped, and often bought. A fire could warm a chamber, but only wealth could truly silence the rest of the house. What happens when even curtains fail? You leave the house. Many couples, especially young or unmarried, sought privacy where no one lived, in barns, bakehouses, or the quiet edge of the forest, places where the cold bit hard, but no one watched. Church records speak of sin committed near the stables or fleshly acts behind the mill wall. These weren't romantic tales, they were simply the only options left. In some villages, guards who patrolled at night caught lovers in fields, under trees, or behind hedges. Punishment followed: fines, whippings, shame, yet the behavior continued. For married couples, it wasn't always about sin. It was about survival. If a home was too full, too loud, too narrow, then love simply had to travel, even if that meant mud, or hay, or the bitter wind of early spring. One 15th century record from Norfolk tells of a couple who lay together on a sack of wheat behind the granary door while the house was filled with guests. The details are stark and yet quietly heroic, because in a world built against privacy, every act of closeness was an act of defiance. Medieval intimacy was never just a private matter. It was regulated, observed, and judged by society. The church spoke often of sex but rarely of love. Within marriage, intimacy was permitted, even expected, but strictly for procreation. Desire without the intent to conceive, suspicious. Lust, even between spouses, dangerous. Confession manuals from the 13th century instructed priests to ask couples whether they had embraced with excessive fondness or spoken wanton words while others slept nearby. Guilt was measured not only by the action itself, but by the setting in which it occurred. The law added more pressure. Fornication, adultery, even unseemly behavior could be brought before church courts, and these courts thrived on what others heard. In one Norwich record from 1442, a neighbor testified that a couple were joined after dark while her mother snored. In another, a maid described the boards creaking and laughter behind the cloth. Homes had thin walls, floors creaked, and people listened. Sometimes it was out of malice, sometimes curiosity, but always someone knew. And so, intimacy was never just between two people. It was a quiet rebellion against judgment, against shame, against the ever-present ear pressed to the timber wall. But in the end, the night offered something truly rare. Not privacy, but mercy. When the candles burned out, when voices faded into sleep, when the cold settled and the dark pressed close, then the world seemed to forget. There in that deep silence, couples found tiny slivers of tenderness. A hand slipped into another, a breath warmed against her neck, words whispered so softly even the mice beneath the straw couldn't hear. No one saw, no one judged. Not the priest, not the children, not even God, perhaps. These weren't grand, passionate affairs. They were small mercies, moments that made the struggle of their daily lives worth bearing. Her husband might kiss his wife's fingers as frost gathered on the windowpane. Her mother might reach across the straw to where her partner lay, just to know he was still there. There in that profound hush, love endured, not with fiery passion, not with poetic declarations, but with patience and stillness. And the darkness, for once, kept its promise to cover, not condemn. Privacy didn't arrive overnight. It crept in slowly, like warmth through a long cold wall. By the late 16th century, change was clearly visible in building plans. In wealthier households, the one-room structure began to give way to separate chambers, a large hall for guests, a kitchen for work, a dedicated bedroom for sleep, and sometimes even a second room called the withdrawing room, specifically meant to pull away from company. Architecture itself began to reflect the growing need for intimacy. Walls were built not just for shelter, but for silence. In towns, multi-story homes emerged. Sleeping areas moved upstairs. Fireplaces were added directly to bedrooms. Shutters became thicker. Doors finally began to lock. For the poor, change came much slower. Rural homes remained crowded, but even there, small steps toward privacy appeared. Fabric partitions, corner beds, simple wooden screens, chimneys reduced smoke. Brick slowly replaced wattle. Glass, once a rarity, began to close the open window spaces. And as privacy became a structural part of homes, intimacy found a new place to breathe, without shame, without witnesses, without interruption. A fundamental shift, not just in physical space, but in what love was allowed to be. So how did couples find intimacy in those cramped one-room homes? They didn't wait for space to be given. They made it. They carved out privacy with simple curtains, with knowing glances, with the deep rhythms of daily life. They held hands behind woven mats, whispered under blankets, and loved without doors or distance. And somehow, despite the cold, the constant noise, and the perpetual nearness of others, they loved deeply, quietly, and persistently. Not because they had privacy, but because they needed each other more than they needed comfort. Love didn't thrive in those homes because the conditions were ideal. It survived because two people chose to see only each other, even with the entire world around them. And maybe, in some profound ways, that's exactly what made it last so long. So the next time you close your bedroom door, or turn on soft music, or dim the light just enough, remember them, the ones who had none of it and still found a way. I've always believed that silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of things too sacred, too profound to speak aloud. When I look back at those one-room homes, dark, crowded, and so cold, I don't see poverty. I see people making space for each other when there was absolutely no space to give. A touch when no one could look. A shared breath when the walls pressed in. A promise spoken without any words at all. In our world today, we can easily close a door, we can switch off a light, but too often we close our hearts as well. Those couples, long gone, knew a different way. They loved not despite discomfort, but through it. And I wonder if that's the kind of love that truly survives longest. Not loud, not grand, just quiet and constant. Two people holding on to each other even when the world gave them no room at all.